But opposition to the war was growing. Voices of those objecting to U.S. involvement in Vietnam were getting louder. In May of 1970, 4 students were killed by National Guard troops during a campus protest at Kent State University in Ohio. Borg learned of the incident while he was on the air reading the news in Cedar Rapids.
And I thought, boy, this is getting out of hand. These student demonstrations are getting out of hand. I don't blame the National Guardsmen. They're trying to keep the peace, but the students have overstepped bounds, and who's at fault here? But we've got to get some order back in the United States because we're fighting a war in South Vietnam, and yet we can't keep the peace in our own country.
The anti-war movement was started due to America's involvement in South Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a conflict between North Vietnam and the government of South Vietnam. The war lasted from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975 with the fall of Saigon. However, the North Vietnamese army was being supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist allies. The South Vietnamese army was supported by the United States, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, and other anti-communist countries. Therefore, the Vietnam War was a proxy war, and many Americans felt that the war was unjustified. There were many Americans who were in support of the Vietnam War, and they were known as the Hawks. Many of those who were in support of the war admitted that involvement was a mistake, but military defeat was unthinkable. Those who did not support the war were called Doves. Doves were prominent figures in the anti-war movement. An anti-war movement is a social movement, usually in opposition to a particular nation's decision to start or carry on an armed conflict, unconditional of a maybe existing just cause. The term can also refer to pacifism, which is the opposition to all use of military force during conflicts. Anti-war activists work through protests and other means to attempt to pressure a government to put an end to a particular war or conflict. The anti-war movement during the Vietnam War lasted from 1964 to the end of the war in 1975. Opposition to U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War began slowly and in small numbers in 1964 on various college campuses. As Americans got deeper into the war, the protests gained more support and grew in numbers. In 1967, a coalition of anti-war activists formed the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, which organized several large anti-war demonstrations between the late 1960s and 1972. Furthermore, the Students for a Democratic Society was created in 1960 and was known for activism against the Vietnam War. For example, the draft was a major source of resentment among college students. The age of the average American soldier serving in Vietnam was 19, 7 years younger than its World War II counterpart. Students observed that young Americans were legally old enough to fight and die, but were not permitted to vote or drink alcohol. Such criticism led to the 26th Amendment, which granted suffrage to 18-year-olds. The anti-war movement included a wide and varied cross-section of Americans from all walks of life. The most prominent people were the hippies. They were young adults who had become disgusted with the war and the society they lived in and rebelled against the traditional American lifestyle, craving peace and happiness. Hippies created their own counterculture that revolved around free love, peace, drugs, and happiness. They were the anti-establishment, outraged by the Vietnam War, and protested for peace. Hippies were nonviolent and turned to drugs and music to rebel and to feel freedom and a new experience. Hippies wanted healthier, more organic food to eat, contrary to the manufactured, TV-style dinners that many Americans had come to enjoy. The hippie movement was all about discovering new things, exploring new ideas, and rebelling against society. Labor unions, government institutions, and people from middle-class suburbs were also against the war. Also, many Latino and African Americans protested the war because a lot of them were being drafted into the war because they were the lower class. Although there were protests at home, there were also protests overseas with soldiers. Inside all branches of the military, soldiers began refusing orders, printing underground anti-war newspapers, and organizing small-scale mutinies which crippled the military's ability to function. Some believed that military spending simply took money away from Great Society's social programs such as welfare, housing, and urban renewal. Many of the anti-war protests were peaceful, however they became violent. The late 1960s became increasingly radical as the activists felt their demands were ignored. Peaceful demonstrations turned violent. When the police arrived to arrest protesters, the crowds often retaliated. Students occupied buildings across college campuses, forcing many schools to cancel classes. Roads were blocked and ROTC buildings were burned. Doves clashed with the police and the National Guard in August 1968, when anti-war demonstrators flocked to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to prevent the nomination of a pro-war candidate. Peaceful protests were the main thing hippies would partake in. There were many different organizations who supported the anti-war movement. For example, Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy, War Resisters League, Committee for Nonviolent Direct Action, the Youth International Party, or Yippies, and the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. The anti-war movement was important because it gave the American people a voice. People believed that the Vietnam War had no clear objectives, appeared to be unwinnable, and innocent lives were being lost.
The Kent State shootings, also known as the May 4th Massacre, occurred on May 4th, 1970. After President Nixon announced the U.S. entry into Cambodia, 28 guardsmen at Kent University in Ohio fired approximately 67 rounds in 13 seconds, which killed 4 students and injured 9 others. Many students also suffered from permanent paralysis and severe trauma. After the violent attack, a student-led strike was held, consisting of approximately 4 million students, and it caused many schools to shut down across the country. This, in turn, led the Kent State shooting to seem more as a civil war than a student protest for its violent effects, and it severely impacted the intent of the United States' entry in war with Vietnam. Several other important protests took place over the course of the anti-war movement, including the March on Washington. The SDS used its new growth to organize a protest in the streets of Washington, D.C. against bombings and war. It attracted attendance of between 200,000 and 300,000 protesters. It was organized by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who had built an alliance of civil rights, labor, and religious organizations. The March on Washington is known to be one of the largest political rallies in American history, and it also has been credited in helping pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. At this march, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in favor of ending racism in the United States. Martin Luther is also credited for giving other speeches that openly opposed the United States' admission into war with Vietnam in general. These important events led to the growth and prosperity of the 1960s anti-war movement.
There were many influential people who protested in the anti-war movement. Born Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. in Louisville, Kentucky on January 14, 1942, the future 3-time world champ changed his name to Muhammad Ali in 1964 after converting to Islam. He scored a gold medal at the 1960 Olympic Games in Rome and made his professional boxing debut against Tony Hussaker on October 29, 1960, winning the bout in 6 rounds. On February 25, 1964, he defeated the heavily favored bruiser Sonny Liston in 6 rounds to become heavyweight champ. He was a celebrity in the eyes of the people, and many looked up to him. On April 28, 1967, with the United States at war in Vietnam, Ali refused to be inducted into the armed forces, saying, "I ain't got no quarrel with those Viet Cong." On June 20, 1967, Ali was convicted of draft evasion, sentenced to 5 years in prison, fined $10,000, and banned from boxing for 3 years. He stayed out of prison as his case was appealed and returned to the ring on October 26, 1970, knocking out Jerry Quarry in Atlanta in the 3rd round. On March 8, 1971, Ali fought Joe Frazier in the fight of the century and lost after 15 rounds, the first loss of his professional boxing career. On June 28th of that same year, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his conviction for evading the draft. Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted into the military due to his religious beliefs. He continued to express his anti-war sentiments alongside many other popular activists, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A group called the Chicago 7 was also made up of anti-war activists. The Chicago 7, originally Chicago 8, also Conspiracy 8 or Conspiracy 7, were 7 defendants: Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, David Dellinger, Tom Hayden, Rennie Davis, John Foines, and Lee Weiner, charged by the federal government with conspiracy, inciting to riot, and other charges related to anti-Vietnam War and countercultural protests that took place in Chicago, Illinois, on the occasion of the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Bobby Seale, the 8th man charged, had his trial severed during the proceedings, lowering the number of defendants from 8 to 7. At the 1968 Democratic National Convention, they organized protest marches and rock concerts. During the event, clashes broke out between the protesters and the police. These crashes turned into a full-scale riot, complete with tear gas and police beatings. The public had full access to this event because the press was originally there for the Democratic Convention. The press denounced the overreaction by police and Chicago Mayor Richard Daley's handling of the situation. The Chicago 7 are important figures in the anti-war movement because they showed both America and politicians that people will continue to protest. It showed that the people's voice will be heard, no matter how many times the police and politicians would try to take them down. Another important figure in the anti-war movement was John Lennon. John Lennon is known for being a singer and songwriter for the popular band The Beatles. However, he was also a very popular hippie and anti-war activist. John Lennon will be known for the many things that he did with the Beatles, but something he will also be remembered for is his ideas about peace. John took a very active role in trying to persuade people to protest against the Vietnam War by doing many different things. He usually worked with his wife, Yoko Ono. Together, they peacefully protested against the Vietnam War and asked the world for peace. The most famous things that John Lennon did to ask for peace was host bed-ins. Bed-ins are when a person will stay in the room for a certain number of days to protest against something. John and Yoko did bed-ins in Montreal and Amsterdam. They stayed in their rooms and recorded Give Peace a Chance in Montreal, which became a very famous anti-war song. Another famous anti-war song that John Lennon wrote is called Imagine. His peace movement did work. One example of the effect that it had was when 500,000 people gathered on the Second Vietnam Moratorium Day. They all started singing Give Peace a Chance as loud as they could. John Lennon was very surprised but happy at the same time. John Lennon was very famous, so there was a lot of media coverage on everything he did, so many people saw what he was trying to do. John Lennon was an influential person throughout the anti-war movement because he was a hippie that was a celebrity. People admired him and wanted to be him. He appealed to the people, and people followed what he did.
Probably the most obvious effect of the 1960s anti-war movement was that it helped to erode U.S. entry into war with Vietnam. However, there were many other long-term effects. The anti-war movement represented a demographic shift in participation in politics to a younger group of people. Because of this, the 26th Amendment was eventually passed, which lowered the voting age to 18. Also, people began to realize that the government wasn't being honest and therefore protested against it, which created a credibility gap. There was a major split in American society between those who believed in more traditional values like patriotism and those who favored more liberal ways. Today, there is still suspiciousness over the government and people have more say in what may happen. Also, rock and roll music, originally begun by John Lennon, still exists today, and the University of California, Berkeley is known for its hippie-friendly culture and promotes peace and love. Overall, the 1960s anti-war movement had a much bigger impact than just preventing a war in Vietnam. It helped to create a new perspective on society and gave people the voice that they needed to make a difference.